The Correctional Services Department is today expected to announce whether former President Jacob Zuma will return to prison or not. Now, this comes after the Constitutional Court last month dismissed Zuma's application to challenge a Supreme Court of Appeal ruling which found his release on medical parole was unlawful. Now, this after he was sentenced to 15 months in jail for defying a court order to testify at the state capture inquiry. But Zuma was released only 2 months into his sentence. Some have linked the July 2021 unrest to Zuma's arrest, which saw widespread looting and over 300 deaths in KwaZulu-Natal and some parts of Gauteng. And on that, let's get some analysis with the political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng. Asanda, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on In Focus.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
So we're still waiting and hopefully this announcement will be made tonight, as they did say it's expected today. But based on what we have seen so far, and the correctional services are saying they've looked at a number of issues and also representation from various parties included. I mean, what does that sort of representation include in this case, Asanda?
Well, I think that they'd have to think very carefully about, first of all, how much of his term is served. They'd have to think about how much of his term he would have to come back and serve, and they'd have to look at, what the difference is between that and whether, that amount of time is actually worth the trouble that it is likely to cause should they recall him back into prison. And so I would imagine that they would be listening to representations from Jacob Zuma's lawyers and various other stakeholders who have a vested interest in this particular case.
Now, we know that there's been a lot of talk about whether the decision, and the court has ruled on that, but the former president served 2 months, and effectively from that initial decision that was taken, served the remainder of his sentence at home, under home arrest, as it were. And one could argue that, well, it's by no fault of Jacob Zuma himself. He can say that, well, I did my part. This had nothing to do with me. Why should I go back to jail?
Well, this is the case that, he's going to have to fight with his lawyers, essentially, if he decides to go and to try and get yet another appeal, if he would be even granted one. And I think that, the problem here is that we unfortunately had a corrupt, commissioner who was siding or on the side of Jacob Zuma and made a decision which was counter what the law had required, which was that Jacob Zuma spend his entire time period in prison. And I think, the fact that he's still here shows us that he isn't as terminally ill as he would have made himself out to be. And I think that, the biggest issue with these cases is not really so much about Jacob Zuma, but it's the precedents that it sets. And so if other prisoners, if he is able to get out of jail free, essentially by claiming terminal illness, it means that other prisoners will also, attempt to get out of jail free by claiming terminal illness, whether it's there or not. And of course, we already have the fact that Shabir Sheikh was released on terminal, on terminal illness, and he managed to live, beyond a miraculous number of years for somebody who has a terminal illness. And so there's already been that negative, that negative precedent set. And if Jacob Zuma is allowed to not go back to prison, as the court has insisted that that decision needs to be relooked at, that is going to have very serious implications for our ability to apply the law when it comes to not just Jacob Zuma, but every other South African. Because remember, the South African law has a principle that, everybody must be treated the same, whether you're a president, a former president, or just, an average Joe on the street. And so they can't make a decision that is going to have implications for millions of other cases, because there are millions of other prisoners who are looking at this case to see what's going to happen in this case, and they are going to be ready to get their people out should Jacob Zuma be allowed to not come back to prison to finish serving his sentences in prison instead of, what he has claimed to have done of serving it at home.
With that said, I mean, again, you look at it from the perspective in terms of just some of the things that happened after his arrest. Do you think that will also have a bearing in the decision as to will we be looking at what happened, the people who died, the unrest that we've seen in KwaZulu-Natal and some parts of Gauteng, to decide on this ruling whether it's a risk worth taking? I know there's been already statements that have been released about how the net joints are ready for any eventuality. But do you think that will also have a bearing, Asanda?
That, at a practical level, of course, it would have some bearing, but it should have bearing insofar as trying to determine whether the security cluster is ready for the potential outbreak of violence, rather than, refusing or choosing to not make the difficult choice of sending Jacob Zuma back to jail because you're scared that, 350 people plus are going to die, 50 billion rands worth of damage is going to be seen. We can't be in a country where one man can threaten the entire country's stability and refuse to go to jail. And I think, one of the things that is different from the last time we've already seen, as you said, the statement that came out that said that, the security cluster is ready. We've got defense force people on the ground. The police have already declared they've got defense force people on the ground. And so there does seem to be a lot more preparation for any eventuality compared to the last time, where I think there was a level where perhaps it took people by surprise that people would actually act out on their threats. And I think what's going to be interesting is to see what happens to not just Jacob Zuma, but also to Asanda Zuma, his daughter, who has, who was leading the fray at the last riots and has already said that her father is definitely not going to be going to jail, which is quite a curious statement to make when the decision hasn't been made, or at the very least hasn't been announced. And it's going to be interesting to see how she is dealt with as somebody who potentially could be rousing violence in the same way that she did the last time her father was forced to go to prison. And I think, the other issue that is still remaining is that a lot of perpetrators were arrested, but the so-called leaders, a lot of them are said to be still out of prison. And so that is going to have implications, because if we still haven't managed to, hold accountable people who acted in illegal ways, really, in 2021, what are the chances that those people are not going to go and do exactly the same thing in 2023, because they've essentially gotten away with it? And so the security cluster is the one that actually is really under a lot of pressure, and the one that everybody will be watching to see how they're going to behave this time, and if they're going to, put the national interests first and ensure that whatever measures need to be taken are taken, so that we don't end up a 50 billion rand loss, and the kind of insecurity that we saw, and the kind of loss of lives that we saw, and also the kind of racism that we saw, with people being killed in Phoenix, for example, and black people being told that they can't enter certain areas, that they can't buy food in certain areas because they were seen to be perpetrators of violence, whether they participated or not. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the state handles things in this particular instance, particularly starting with Jacob Zuma's daughter and other instigators. And of course, also it's going to be interesting to see what the commissioner decides in the end, because it does kind of fall on them to make the final decision. But not only make the final decision, they're going to have to put forward very compelling reasons if for whatever reason they say Jacob Zuma cannot go to jail. And if they say they must go back, they also will have to specify and explain why they think that should be the case, and why they would be, why they would be coming to a different conclusion to their predecessor.
And just finally, Asanda, how much of a bearing, whichever way the decision goes, do you think this will have on the ANC going into elections next year, whether it will have or not?
I think it's definitely going to have a bearing, because I think that July 2021 really bruised the ANC and showed them as incapable of, keeping their own people accountable. And so they did a good thing in that they put somebody who was supposed to be in jail, but then they didn't protect the people from the fallout of Jacob Zuma being jailed. And so if, we see a repeat of that, it's going to be a big problem, and people are going to lose even further of the little faith that they have in the ANC. in the ANC's ability to secure themselves. Because remember, there are people who lost their businesses in 2021 who still haven't been able to recover from that. And you have people that even actually moved physically from the KwaZulu-Natal and moved to other provinces because they felt like the province was volatile. And if, one man's imprisonment could cause that, then how would they know that, they don't have a feeling around security in terms of what actually is required in this province for it to break out into violence, as we saw in July of 2021. And so I think the ANC is under a lot of pressure, and I'm sure that's why they made sure to release statements to say that the security cluster is ready, because last time it wasn't. And also they need to kind of allay the fears of business people, allay the fears of ordinary citizens who do not want to be caught up in, the scary mess that July 2021 was.
Asanda, thank you very much for taking time to speak to us. That is political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng.